He didn't flinch. In front of flashing cameras, stern advisors, and rising tension across the continent, the Premier of Ontario stood firm, his voice unwavering. "I will not hesitate to increase this charge if necessary. And if the United States escalates, I will not hesitate to shut the electricity off completely." It was more than a political threat. It was a tectonic shift. A statement that the time of Canadian dependence on the American economic machine was over. "We can't be relying on the U.S. any longer," he continued, his tone sharp, urgent. "We have to start building pipelines west, north, and east." And just like that, the dominoes began to fall: supply chains, trade routes, energy flows, and nearly a century of quiet North American interdependence. "I'm fighting like hell," the Premier added, "and we're going to protect Canada." It was a line that made headlines not just because of what he said, but because of who he was saying it to. He's underestimating the Canadian people, the resilience of the Canadian people, and the strength of the Canadian people. This wasn't some rhetorical posturing in a local campaign. This was a message aimed straight at Washington. "I feel terrible for the American people," he continued, softening, but only for a moment. "Because it's not the American people who started this trade war. It's one person who's responsible. That's President Trump. This wasn't the way things were supposed to unfold. Not here. Not between two of the most intertwined economies in modern history. But in early 2025, something cracked. And when it did, the shock didn't come from California or Texas or even Capitol Hill. It came from the quiet industrial heart of Canada. Ontario had just signed a $20 billion electric vehicle battery deal with Volkswagen. But not one single battery from that deal was going to the United States. Not one. Not to Michigan. Not to Texas. Not to California. Every cell from the new St. Thomas Gigafactory was bound for Europe. 1 million batteries per year, powering 1 million European cars, with zero destined for the American market. The message was as cold and deliberate as it was clear. This wasn't about electric vehicles. This was about trust, or rather, the collapse of it. This was economic betrayal playing out in real time. A silent but strategic reordering of global priorities. There was no press conference announcing the break. No grand gesture or summit handshake. It happened quietly, efficiently, and with seismic consequences. A reshuffling of allegiances. A rerouting of logistics. A redefinition of loyalty. And in every boardroom from Detroit to Dallas, the reverberations were impossible to ignore. To understand how things reached this point, you have to rewind the tape. The breaking point wasn't the deal, it was the memory. The memory of a decision made years earlier, when the Trump administration doubled tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum. 50% duties slapped on goods that once represented the industrial spine of a unified North America. In Washington, it was branded economic protection. In Ontario, it felt like betrayal. For decades, Canada and the U.S. had built a mutual economic rhythm: power grids, cross-border factories, synchronized supply chains. The border wasn't just porous. Economically, it was nearly imaginary. Parts flowed freely. Engineers worked across lines. A car might be assembled in Canada with a transmission from Ohio and a frame from Windsor. The entire auto industry was one breathing organism, split only by flags on a map. But when the U.S. turned those trade routes into weapons, Canada took notice. Ontario, the most deeply embedded in this automotive dance, didn't just shrug and move on. It reoriented. The Volkswagen Gigafactory was never just about jobs or green tech. It was a declaration of independence. Retraining centers popped up across Ontario, not aligned with Ford or GM, but with European automakers. Welding and robotics courses were suddenly taught in German. Local parts suppliers who once bid for contracts in Detroit found themselves negotiating with Berlin and Munich. The shift wasn't gradual. It was a pivot, and it was intentional. In St. Thomas, Ontario, a town once dependent on American industry, construction began on a site that would become one of the largest battery factories in the Western Hemisphere. 370 acres. Over 3,000 direct jobs. Enough battery capacity to electrify more than 1 million vehicles per year. But not one of those vehicles would roll onto a U.S. freeway. The production pipeline flowed east across the Atlantic. The United States wasn't just excluded. It was never considered. And powering this entire operation wasn't just machinery, it was ideology. The electricity came from Ontario's grid: nuclear, hydro, and nearly emissions-free. For decades, this grid had quietly powered cities on both sides of the border. Ontario's electrons lit up Buffalo and Detroit just as much as they lit up Toronto. But now that power wasn't just a domestic benefit, it was a geopolitical weapon. And Canada was ready to use it. When Trump's tariffs returned in early 2025, Ontario responded, not with words but with wires. A temporary surcharge was placed on electricity exported to U.S. states. Just a few cents but enough to cause panic. Grid simulation teams in New York and Michigan were forced into emergency scenarios. What if the charge wasn't temporary? What if the flow was cut entirely? The models were catastrophic. Hospitals in upstate New York initiated backup power drills. Rural districts in Minnesota began rationing peak hour consumption. Public utilities that had never contemplated losing their northern supply were suddenly digging through contracts for any legal protection. Inside the Pickering Nuclear Generating Station, a supervisor spoke to reporters under condition of anonymity. "This is not a light switch," he said. "You don't just pause a reactor. The power has to flow somewhere. And when it doesn't, it's not just a shutdown, it's a meltdown." That flow, once seen as a symbol of unity, had become leverage. And Ontario made it crystal clear, they were holding the switch. For decades, the interconnectedness of Canada and the U.S. was framed as a strength, an example of peaceful economic fusion. But in the new reality of 2025, that interdependence has turned into vulnerability. What once joined two allies is now a liability. And Canada, particularly Ontario, is making sure it has other options. Instead of renewing North American trade commitments, the country is building alternatives. Pipelines not to the south but to the north and the east. Infrastructure designed not for continental integration, but for continental independence. And the message hasn't gone unnoticed. In Paris, Prime Minister Mark Carney made headlines when he chose not to visit Washington for his first international trip. Instead, he met with European leaders and energy ministers. Instead of handshakes in the White House, he raised a glass in Brussels. His speech, though diplomatic, left no ambiguity. Canada was seeking new partnerships for a changing world. That change, everyone knew, meant turning away from Washington. This wasn't just about policy. It was about a shift in identity. Canada had always been a quiet partner, a reliable neighbor, the polite player in the grand scheme of international politics. But now it was something else. Assertive, strategic, and no longer willing to be taken for granted. The trade war with the United States may have started with steel, but it evolved into something far more foundational. A reevaluation of trust, of reliance, of sovereignty. And while American policymakers scrambled to decipher what went wrong, the real story was already written in concrete and steel across Ontario's transformed industrial corridor. In the hum of new machinery built for a market across the ocean. In the silence of once active pipelines running dry. In the flicker of lights dimming in Buffalo and Rochester, not from storms or failures, but from decisions made far to the north. He didn't say it outright. He didn't need to. When Prime Minister Mark Carney stood beside French President Emmanuel Macron at the Élysée Palace, what followed was not a speech but a signal. A calculated shift. In the same way tectonic plates move beneath the Earth's crust with slow, deliberate force, this was the first public fracture of a once unshakable alliance. He initiated a full strategic review of all Canada-US defense contracts. Not with hostility. Not with headlines. But with intent. The kind of intent that redefines relationships, redraws global supply maps, and echoes far beyond diplomatic receptions. Inside the glass towers of Brussels and the government halls of Berlin, the message landed instantly. Canada was shifting. Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly accelerated talks to expand the Canada-EU Free Trade Agreement. Defense integration began veering off the well-trodden American path. Canada no longer tied its military future to US-made platforms. The reasons weren't ideological. They were structural, because American technology always came with strings. Strings about when it could be used. Strings about where it could be exported. Strings about sovereignty, about limitations, about submission. That's not what Canada wanted anymore. European defense manufacturers, SAB, Dassault, BAE Systems, sensed the shift and moved quickly. They offered something Washington didn't: co-development, mutual benefit, technology sharing. Canada was no longer playing junior partner in someone else's strategic script. It was building something more ambitious: autonomy. Strategic autonomy. In Windsor, Ontario, a once-shuttered electric vehicle charger factory roared back to life. Not for Detroit's highways but for Rotterdam's city grids. Orders written in Dutch. Shipments logged in euros. Ports aligned not with the North American standard, but with European regulations. This wasn't isolationism. This was insulation. From volatility. from political cycles that weaponized trade, from administrations that saw economic partnerships as zero-sum games. The response wasn't angry rhetoric. It was rewiring, subtle, structural, and permanent. Wind farms in Saskatchewan were now feeding Nordic grids. Hydrogen hubs in Alberta were laying pipeline blueprints toward Europe and Asia. Battery corridors in New Brunswick weren't calibrated for North American trucks. They were designed for transatlantic shipping lines. And while no banner waved to announce it, a new phrase began to echo through Ottawa's financial and industrial circles. Strategic autonomy, not free trade. Not open markets. Strategic autonomy. A new doctrine born not from ideology but from necessity. There was no breaking news headline to capture it. No joint declaration to codify it. But the map had changed. And so had the money. By mid-2025, European capital was flowing into Canadian infrastructure at record speed. Not dollars but euros, kroner, and yens. Norwegian sovereign wealth funds. Dutch green energy grants. German climate bonds. While Wall Street remained distracted by domestic politics and short-term volatility, Canada looked elsewhere for stability. Oslo, Amsterdam, Berlin. Ottawa stopped looking to New York for reassurance and found permanence across the Atlantic. Canadian pension giants followed suit. The Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, the Ontario Municipal Employees Retirement System, both began rebalancing their portfolios, not just in strategy but in geography. Billions in assets pulled from U.S.-exposed equities. Billions redirected into EU-aligned ventures. Electric vehicle supply chains. Renewable energy projects. Cross-ocean hydrogen innovation parks. America, once the gravity well of North American capital, was now being viewed with caution. Not because of its industries but because of its instability. The risk wasn't economic, it was political. Tariffs are not just taxes. They are signals. They erode the foundation of trust that takes generations to build. And once broken, that trust does not regenerate with the next election cycle. It withers. It is replaced by contingency plans, by exit strategies, by long-term alternatives. What is unfolding now isn't a dramatic divorce, it's a quiet decoupling. No theatrics. Just contracts rerouted. Ports reoriented. Orders redirected. Nickel from Sudbury. Cobalt from northern Quebec. Lithium from Manitoba. These raw materials once fed the machines of American factories. Now they're headed east through new agreements bound by long-term certainty. German buyers have signed directly with indigenous managed lands in Canada. Supply is locked in. Not short-term, not seasonal, decades-long contracts. Not speculation. Commitment. The Volkswagen Gigafactory in St. Thomas, the one that captured headlines with its scale and ambition? That's not the grand finale. It's the prototype. A blueprint for how future deals will be structured. With Europe at the center. With the US as an optional node, not the axis. And if Ontario can disentangle itself from the American auto market after decades of complete integration, what else is possible? What happens when British Columbia does the same with lumber? What happens when Quebec decides that its hydropower is more valuable to Iceland than to New England? The United States, once the final destination in every Canadian export plan, is now just another line on the spreadsheet. No longer assumed, no longer guaranteed. Inside Ontario's innovation corridor, the transformation is visible, tangible, irreversible. Engineering students aren't training with a focus on U.S. automotive codes. They're studying EU emission standards. Quality control systems are being calibrated not in English alone, but in French and German, because the customer base demands it. And the AI systems doing real-time production optimization? They're being trained on datasets from Munich, not Milwaukee. All of this is happening with astonishing speed. And yet Washington seems unaware, or worse, dismissive. The prevailing belief inside the Beltway remains the same, that America, by sheer size and force, can always pull partners back into orbit. That if it yells loud enough, the system will snap back into place. But systems don't work like that anymore. In a world of autonomous supply chains, digitized logistics, and algorithmic finance, realignments don't need to be announced. They just happen. And so while Washington debates the next round of tariffs or incentives, the ships are still departing. The factories are still humming. The ports are still loading. But they're not headed where they used to. They're bypassing Baltimore and Los Angeles. They're docking in Antwerp, in Rotterdam, in Marseille. And that change isn't just practical, it's philosophical. Canada isn't cutting ties. It's building alternatives. And in a world where trust is more valuable than treaties, those alternatives matter more than ever. The quiet decoupling has become a quiet awakening. Canada is not waiting for America to fix its internal dysfunction. It is not waiting for stability to return to Capitol Hill. It has moved on. Not out of anger but out of clarity. The realization that reliance is vulnerability. That goodwill cannot replace governance. That trade deals are only as strong as the people who honor them. This isn't just about economics. It's about a national identity redefined, not by loud declarations but by deliberate steps. A country that once saw itself as America's shadow is now casting one of its own. One that stretches not southward but across the Atlantic. And behind this shift is not a singular politician or party, but a collective decision. By provinces, by investors, by engineers, by energy producers. They've all stopped asking whether the US will come back to the table. Because the table has moved. It now sits on European timbers under different lights with new rules. Rules shaped not by dominance but by reciprocity. Not by fear but by foresight. And as the sun sets over the sprawling solar fields of Saskatchewan, as wind turbines spin silently over the shores of Newfoundland, and as rail cars filled with battery-grade lithium roll steadily toward Atlantic ports, the message becomes unmistakable. This is not retaliation. This is reinvention. The lines that once defined North America's economic future have been redrawn. Not in anger. Not in haste. But in preparation for a world where interdependence must be earned, not assumed. The age of automatic alliance is over. And unless Washington wakes up to that fact soon, it will find the conversation has already moved on, and it wasn't invited to the next meeting.